Okay. All right. We have three other speakers: Ms. Meserve, Barry Nelson, Audrey Kelm, in that order. Mr. Zlotnick, you're speaking for. Okay, Ms. Well, oh, you want to speak in addition, or are you representing Ms. Meserve? Oh, okay, I just want to know. Okay, Mr. Zlotnick also wants to speak. Okay, Mr. Nelson.
Thank you, Chairman, members of the Council, and staff. And I will start by thanking staff as well for their tremendously hard work on this challenging issue. I want to start by suggesting that it seems to me that there's been some real confusion between two issues. On the one hand, what 7X1 did was to establish a broad state goal, a state policy of reducing reliance on the Delta. And I think we need to get that clear. And then to clarify the narrow application that staff has been talking about in this case. And I think one of the confusions in this discussion is that some folks are talking about the narrow application of this broad state goal, and some folks are talking about the broad state goal as a whole. And I'd like to start that. I think the path forward is to clarify those two things. I think the state legislature did say reduce reliance means reduce use, what Mr. Huffman said, as Mr. Huffman's letter said. But that's a different question from how the council applies that state goal narrowly in this specific policy. And I think it's important to separate those two things because the legislature did not create that broad state goal and say to the council, go make every water user do this now. It established a broad state goal, and you're taking what is, as staff has pointed out, a very small step to make some progress in applying that goal. But I think separating the broad goal from this narrow application would really go a long way in eliminating some of the confusion here. A couple of other observations. First is, I think it's important to look at how the different pieces of the plan and the legislation fit together. And I'll just give one example of that. The legislation required the State Water Board to produce flow criteria. They have done that. Now, it's important to note those are scientific findings. Those are not regulatory requirements yet. But those scientific findings pointed in a direction, pointed towards reduction in total diversions from the Delta. We don't know what final numbers will come out of the State Board process, but I think the direction at this point is relatively clear. The interpretation that some folks have offered would allow us to achieve, under some definitions of reducing reliance, would allow us to achieve reductions in reliance on the Delta, even if every water user in the watershed took more water from the watershed. And to me, it's very difficult to make those two pieces of your Delta plan fit together. How can you look at the State Board findings, which are required to inform your deliberations, and adopt a definition of water of reduced reliance that's so loose that it would allow every water user in the watershed to divert more? It's tough for me to see how those two things would fit together. A couple of other simple observations. The first is that I was surprised by the interpretation that some have offered that the discussion of future reliance refers to some increment between now and the future date. As someone who was very deeply involved in that legislation, that's a new interpretation to me of that language. What was meant by those of us who were working very hard on that language was that we don't know what an individual water district's needs might be in the future. It might be the same as their needs today. It might be less than their needs today. It might be more than their needs today. But in meeting those needs, they should be less reliant on the Delta. So I think, from my perspective, that's a pretty simple one. As Assemblyman Huffman's letter said, if the legislature had meant a reduction in per capita water use, that's what they would have said. And again, in terms of looking at how this package fits together, they did say that in a formal binding requirement in 7X7, in the 20 by 2020 piece. So there's a reason the language in 7X1 was different. The program in 7X7 is very clearly a meaningful regulatory requirement that has pretty broad applicability. What was established in 7X1 was a state goal of reducing reliance. We think that means volume. So your challenge is defining that broad goal and then defining the narrow applicability here. And as staff has pointed out, there are few circumstances under which this policy would actually kick in. And I think that's That's where the confusion lies, between that broad goal and the narrow applicability here. And then finally, I do think that it's important to acknowledge the different water users, and I think the document does this, but I think it sounds as though from the testimony you've heard today that it could go farther, that it makes sense to acknowledge that different water users have different abilities to reduce their reliance. If you're a Southern California water agency, you have tools at your disposal that you don't have if you're the city of Reading or an in-Delta water user. But every water user has some tools that they can use to reduce their reliance on the Delta. And I think it's important for us to encourage all water users to use all of those tools, but to acknowledge that if you're an in-Delta farmer, you do have a narrower set of tools available than if you're the city of Santa Monica. Thank you.
Thank you.